Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's a privilege for me as the manager of the infrastructure and energy sector
Cultura y energía
to
contar
have you
con su
all here
presencia y su
participating
participación
in
en
this
esto que es
forum
el
on
foro sobre
infrastructure at the
infraestructura
service
al
of gender
servicio de la
equity. It's a
igualdad de
real
género.
pleasure to have all of
Un
you
gusto
here.
tenerles acá.
We are
Vamos a
certainly going to
aprender
learn a great
mucho
deal about
sobre
the
los sectores de
transportation, water, and
transporte,
sanitation and
agua y
energy
saneamiento
sectors
y
with a
energía
perspective
desde
on
una
gender.
perspectiva de
How
género.
can we do
¿Cómo se puede
more
hacer
for
más
the gender agenda
en la
within the
agenda de
region?
género
And
en la
how
región y
can we
cómo a través del
demonstrate
ejemplo
great
podemos mostrar
experiences with a great deal of
grandes
leadership
experiencias con
regarding
mucho
everything that's been
liderazgo de
done in
lo
the
que se ha
region
hecho
to
en toda
move
la
this
región
topic
para avanzar en
forward?
este importante tema
Before
para
we
nosotros.
begin, I'd like to remind
Antes de
everybody that we
iniciar, bueno,
have
les recordamos que
simultaneous
hay traducción
interpretation
simultánea
services in Spanish and English,
en
and
español
we
e
also
inglés
have
y
sign
también
language
contamos con
interpretation. For the
interpretación de
folks that are
señas.
joining us
Para las
here in
personas que nos
person, we
acompañan de manera
have
presencial,
the
bueno, están los
headphones,
audífonos.
and
Ahí
you
pueden
can use
hacer la
those to select the
selección del
language
idioma que
of your
ustedes prefieren.
preference.
Y las
And
personas
for
que
those who
nos
are joining us
acompañan
through the virtual
virtualmente,
platform,
en
you
la
could go
parte baja
to
de su
the
pantalla hay un icono
interpretation
con un munito y
icon
pueden también hacer
represented
la
by the globe
selección del
at the
idioma de su
bottom of
preferencia.
your Zoom screen
Les
and
decía
select
pues
the
que
language
tenemos
of
el
your
privilegio de
preference.
contar
Today we have
con
great
grandes
leaders
líderes
in
en
the
la agenda de género en
arena of
infraestructura
gender
en la
equity in
región
the
y
region,
sin
and we
duda
can
poder
hear
aprender
firsthand
de
from
primera
them
voz directamente de
what they've
ellos lo
been
que se ha
doing in their
hecho
various
en sus
areas of
diferentes ámbitos de
operations. This
gestión.
will be very
Va a ser no
enriching,
solo
not
muy
just for those
enriquecedor
of us
para
here at the
nosotros en el
band,
banco,
in the
sino también
bank,
para todas
but
nuestras
also for all
contrapartes
of our
en los
partners
países que
and
están
counterparts,
atendiendo
especially those
este
who are
evento de
joining
manera
us
virtual.
virtually.
Un
It's a real
gusto
pleasure
tenerlos
to have
acá
all of you
y
here,
muchas gracias por
as
estar
well as
presentes
those of you who are here in
de
person.
manera física.
Throughout the course of
Lo que
the
vamos a
day, what
buscar
we would
va a
like
ser
to do
a lo
is
largo del
address a
día
number of topics
atender
within
varios
the
temas en la agenda de
gender and
género en
infrastructure
infraestructura y vamos a centrarnos en
arena,
dos
and we will
preguntas
be
muy
trying to answer
fundamentales,
two main
en dos paneles que
questions. The
vamos a estar
first has to do
coordinando.
with the benefits
El
and
primero tiene que ver con
opportunities
los beneficios
that exist to
y
be able
oportunidades que
to
hay para
recruit
poder
more
traer al
women
sector
into
de
the infrastructure
infraestructura a
sector.
más mujeres.
We always run into
Siempre
the
nos encontramos
excuse
con el pretexto
that
de que
says, well, women
luego
aren't
no les
really
interesa,
interested
no
in
les
the
interesa mucho el
infrastructure
sector de
sector, and I think
infraestructura. A
this
mí me
is
parece
not
que esa es una
correct.
falacia.
I think there's a great deal
Hay
of
el
interest. We
interés,
have the
existe la
opportunity
oportunidad
to
para
do
hacerlo
something about
y
it,
no solo se trata de
and
que podamos
we
tener
don't
en el
just
sector de
want to address
infraestructura por el lado de la
infrastructure on
provisión de
the
servicios,
service
sino
supply
también por el
side, but
tipo de
or on
oferta que
demand for
tenemos en los
services
servicios que
side, but
damos,
also on the
que haya
supply
una
side.
mejor atención a este importante
Another
tema.
very important
Y
point
el otro
is
también muy
to
importante
not
no es
just
solo ver cómo
recruiting
tener,
and retaining more
capturar y
female talent
retener
in the sector
más
and
talento
help
femenino en
our
el sector
counterparts
y
to do
ayudar a
so,
nuestras contrapartes a
but
hacerlo,
also
sino
to
también
see how
ver
we could have a
cómo
much more
podemos tener
inclusive
una agenda
agenda
mucho
where we
más
talk about
inclusiva en
the
la provisión de
provision of
nuestros servicios
infrastructure services in
en
all
todas
areas,
las áreas,
transportation,
transporte,
water,
agua y
sanitation,
saneamiento
and
y energía.
energy. How
¿Cómo
can we
podemos
provide our
proveer
services
nuestros
in a way
servicios de
that
forma
they
que
are
sean
more
muy inclusivos?
inclusive? How can we
Que
really
sintamos que
feel
realmente
that we are closing
estamos
the
cerrando la
gender
brecha de
gap and
género
through our
y que a
actions
través de
we are
nuestra
actually
participación
making a
estamos haciendo
difference?
una diferencia en
So
esta
with the
región.
idea to
Con el fin de conceptualizar
conceptualize the
las
ideas that
discusiones
we
que
have
tendremos el día de hoy,
today, we're going to
vamos a
see
presentar un breve
a
video de
video
50 minutos
that we
que
will
vamos a
share, and
compartir
we
y
will
después de ello
subsequently
vamos a tener la
hear
participación de
from our
nuestro
president,
presidente,
Ilan
Ilan Wolfan, para hablar sobre la agenda
Goldfein,
de trabajo en
Goldfein,
temas de
who will
género
talk
en
to us
el banco.
about the
Vamos
gender
adelante con el
agenda.
video, por favor.
Let's go on to the video. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
And this represents a great deal of the work
Esto
that we
representa
do
mucho del
and
trabajo que
does so in a
hacemos
very
de
visual
manera muy
way
visual
as part
dentro
of the
del
activities of
banco
the
y
bank and the
particularmente en el
Department of
Departamento de
Infrastructure and
Infraestructura y Energía.
Energy. I'd
Le
like to
doy entonces
now
ahora la bienvenida
welcome the
al
IDB
presidente
President,
Ilan Wolfan
Ilan
para
Goldfein,
iniciar
to
de manera formal ya el evento.
provide us with some welcoming
Muchas gracias. 'Muchas 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 gra
Thank you. I thought I was going to
Gracias,
have to
oye,
wait
yo
for
pensé
50
que me iba a quedar
minutes.
50 minutos aquí. Um, Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Talk about infrastructure, gender. There are topics on my heart, and those are priorities for us. I want to thank all of you that have come here, ministers, private sector colleagues who have traveled from all over the place to join us. I have to say that this event comes at a moment when governments across the region are navigating a very complex outlooks. I don't have to tell you that poverty has raised, inequality has raised. According to INFRALAC projections for 2022, 1/3 of the region's total population lives in poverty. We're talking about 82 million that live from those in extreme poverty. When you look at these numbers, you see an additional issue that women are always the hardest hit. Female poverty exceeds male poverty by an average of 3 percentage points in the region. This is a recurrent indicator of gender inequality in our countries, and we do need to work harder to fix that. In addition to the economic and social challenges, we also must face another priority, which is climate change. Achieving the goals established by the Paris Agreements will require transformations, not only of energy matrices, but also social transformations, such as those expected in the labor force. For countries to advance in their fight against climate change, both men and women must be able to actively participate in politics, legislation, planning, decision-making, and be the agents of change. Development without half of the population is simply not feasible. We can no longer afford to leave women behind. And here is where infrastructure plays a significant role. The infrastructure sector is at the top of employment generation in all our countries. I like to look at numbers. Infrastructure today employs 50 million people. Just to give you an idea, it's around 40%, 14%. When you look at women, they account only 13% of the total. So it's 13 of the 14, small part. These averages hide large disparities across countries and types of jobs, as women tend to be underrepresented in leadership positions. We need to promote more diverse workforces in technical and in leadership positions, as we've seen here with several of you being leaders. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with the ongoing digital and green transformation of the sector, and we need to attract and retain more women so they can benefit from better paid jobs that are available now and in the future. Achieving universal access to high quality and affordable transport, electricity, water, sanitation will reduce poverty for everybody. As of today, 19 million people in the region still do not have access to safe water, and about the same number lack access to electricity. That's a lot of people. More than 450 million people lack access to safely managed sanitation. In some cities, and you know a lot of them, people spend more than 90 minutes in traffic. I know cities that take more than 90 minutes. All of these challenges have a larger impact on women as they negatively affect their living conditions while undermining their education and economic opportunities. Let me give you a few examples. Most women in the region suffer sexual harassment in public transport. A survey in 15 cities worldwide revealed that more than 60% of women have suffered sexual harassment in public transportation where the survey was conducted in Mexico, Bogota, and Lima. Likewise, considering that women tend to take a disproportionate share of household work, they are often the primary users and managers of the water, of the energy in their households. Therefore, when these systems fail or just don't exist, women are forced to travel long distance over many hours to meet their family's water and energy needs. At the IDB, we have been working very hard to make a difference and have a strong gender in infrastructural agenda. I can tell you that my commitment is to work even harder going forward. As of today, 100% of our projects include gender actions, and there are investment funds assigned to reduce gender gaps. But I'm going to be looking for this 100% to be actually effective, that we actually implement what is said there. Most of our work has been focused on designing and implementing pilot projects to promote women's participation in non-traditional jobs within the sector to make sure that they take advantage of the employment opportunities generated by the projects. Let me give you examples again. The Bogota public transportation operators, La Rolita, for example, became the first public transportation company in the region with a majority of women drivers after 450 female electricity bus drivers completed an IDB-supported program. We expect a similar outcome in Panama, where indigenous women are being trained in the installation of photovoltaic systems, in water and sanitation. Within a project that we have financed with the government of Spain, 113 women who were trained in plumbing and other weather-related jobs in the municipality of Sica Sica, La Paz, Bolivia. Of course, we still have a long way to go, and there's always room for improvement. We need to invest more efficiently in gender equality to escalate our gender initiatives and benefit more women and everybody in general. We also need to institutionalize our work by creating strategies that guide our work and specific goals for the short, medium, and longer term, which will help us monitor results, improve effectiveness, measure the impacts of our work, and has an input for a next generation of evidence-based policy making. I see an horizon full of possibilities. Gender-based and direct investment in gender equality is a lever towards achieving sustainable infrastructure services and providing opportunities to create equal economic and social development. But more than that, it's a way to improve the quality of life for all the people. At the IDB Group, gender equality is at the top priority in both our operations and in the generation and dissemination of knowledge. This is also a great opportunity for combining efforts between governments and the private sector to improve the lives of millions of women in Latin America and the Caribbean. So today, I invite you all to challenge each other and to propose new ideas and solutions for how we can better work together to improve the lives of women throughout the region. Thank you very much. Less than 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for not taking the 50 minutes. Clearly, you provided us with very important messages, and undoubtedly these are the topics that we need to incorporate in our workflow, especially related to our activities in infrastructure. Now I'd like to yield the floor to my colleague, Calidad Caridad Araujo,
que es la
the
jefa de
chief of
división
the
de
Gender and
género
Diversity
y de
Division
inclusión y
at the bank,
diversidad
and with
dentro
whom
del
we've
banco,
worked
con quien
extensively
hemos hecho mucho
on this
en esta
work
agenda de
agenda, not
trabajo y
just
con
through
quien
the
no solo a
collaboration
través
and
de la
extraordinary
colaboración de
ideas.
varias ideas
We've started
empezamos a
to
implementar
implement
agendas
very
muy innovadoras
innovative
alrededor de toda
agendas
la
throughout the
región en
region
temas de género
that
e
focus on
infraestructura.
gender
Gracias,
equity.
querida.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Ariel. Good morning to everyone who is here. For me, it's a great pleasure to join you today, and I'm very grateful to the people who are here in person, as well as with those who are joining us here virtually. I'm very happy to provide you with some brief comments to open today's session. It's been only a decade since we started to talk about gender and infrastructure, something that prior to that did not happen very frequently. These were two topics that really didn't fit with each other, and at that time it was almost impossible to imagine bringing together ministers, men and women ministers, leaders of companies and the private sector participating and focusing on this topic. But we see that the reality has changed, and we are here called to review and revise the agenda based on the experiences, and we are starting to see the progress that we've begun to make in the region. And this is an example that we are taking important steps in the region, especially in the infrastructure realm. Now we don't ask whether or not infrastructure and gender are two topics that belong in the same phrase, but rather we're talking about how to create more ideas to drive this forward, how we can include these concepts in projects and what we can do to make their impact much greater. During these years of work, because this has been a long-term process that has generated many products and it has been headed primarily by the infrastructure department, has allowed us to learn many lessons regarding how we can continue pushing, driving forward this agenda and expand our vision. I'd like to share three different insights with you. The first one is that working in an isolated way in silos doesn't really work. It's not enough to have one person that knows about gender, social issues on the executing agency side. But we need to bring about change in the commitment for the entire team that's in the process of implementing a project, any project. And this is one way to make sure that gender activities become a part of the project DNA. It's not an added value, but rather a fundamental element of the development agenda and the closure of the gender gap that we are pursuing. The second insight is that all of the stakeholders need to be sitting at the same table when we incorporate a gender focus on anything that we do. And this includes calling for and working hand in hand with other stakeholders whenever we build an economic case for a potential project. And we also need to bring about a change in behavior for all of the stakeholders that are included. This includes unions, different agencies, and even the institutions in charge of developing human talent. That is to say, this is a very broad project that is also very challenging. The third insight is that we need more evidence and more data that will allow us to better inform our public policy making regarding how we can make changes in a more cost-effective way, how these interventions for closing the gender gap can work more effectively. So this is clearly an agenda that requires financial and human resources. It requires a great deal of learning, monitoring, oversight, and evaluation. The challenges posed by the gender topic in infrastructure are great, but we've managed to achieve some measure of progress, many of them headed and led by the IDB, but many others led by the different countries. And I think it's worthwhile to highlight some of these success stories, as our president was mentioning just a few moments ago. When we talk about training and educating and skills building for women in the infrastructure sector, we've seen some very interesting steps, and I'm just going to give you some examples. The Transportation Division has worked on some pilot projects in Nicaragua, Paraguay to train women in how to operate heavy machinery. Up until the year 2021, we had trained 229 women in this particular discipline. But as I mentioned, or as we heard from our president a few moments ago, the Energy Division is also training women to install and maintain solar panel facilities. And these are important exercises, not just because we are diversifying our labor force, but because of the demonstrative impact that it has in injecting women in non-traditional occupations. And this changes the image, the aspirations, the dreams of little girls throughout our region. And it also conveys a very important message to society at large regarding the changes in social norms that are based on structural norms that are based on inequality. So for this reason, these initiatives are extremely important. Now, we have other examples of interesting and fascinating projects carried out by our colleagues. For example, in the water and sanitation realm, we've done some activities whereby companies can look within their operations and look at their gender gaps, as well as the key measures that they can undertake to close them. This includes training for personnel, bringing about reforms within their own organizational structures. These are important steps that we've made. These are necessary steps, and clearly we want to uh, delve deeper and expand the impact of these activities. We want to continue contributing to the closure of the gender gap by adopting an ever more ambitious agenda that will allow us to take these activities to scale. All of this, of course, takes time, effort, human and financial resources, but as a group, we have the commitment to carry these projects forward in a coordinated way from the technical and cross-sectoral side. Events such as this one are key for us to be able to sit down at the same table and reflect on the lessons learned, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and it also offers up lessons for us to improve what we do. And it also allows us a space to think about the agenda in the future. How can we continue with this coordination of closing the gender gap with a strong focus on inclusion and diversity, as well as the gender agenda? It's important for spaces such as this one, not just provide information, but also allows us to address the challenges that your organizations face in trying to reach your goals of closing the gender gap. It's important that we work together to discuss what we can do to overcome these barriers. I hope that you enjoy the panels that we will have today. I think they will be very enriching and productive for those of us who are here in person, but also for those who are working in the different countries on this agenda, and for all of those who share this commitment to bring about change with regard to the gender gap. I'm quite certain that we will all leave this workshop with more knowledge and a stronger commitment as well, a stronger subset of tools to be able to move this topic forward. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Caridad, and we will surely be taking up these concepts throughout the course of the panels, how we can be more ambitious and how we can improve the impact of our various interventions. Now I'd like to take advantage of the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Laurin Mortes Calero. I'm a specialist for the Transportation Division, and I will be joining you as the Master of Ceremonies for the rest of the day. In keeping with our agenda, we're going to move on to a fireside chat on the topic of the gender gap and subconscious biases and the impact that this has in the labor market. For this purpose, I'd like to invite to the stage Ana Maria Pinto, Transportation Division Chief for the IDB, and Carolyn Lickler, Executive Director for Canada at the IDB. Ana Maria and Carolyn, you have the floor.
Caroline, the floor is yours. Am I on?
Yeah.
Am I on?
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. Buenos días para todos. And I'm very excited to be here today to talk about gender gaps and unconscious biases. Before presenting our guests, I would like the audience to reflect for a few minutes if you believe that when you have to make a decision, you don't have any prejudice against a person or a group in compared to another. And why do I ask you to do this? In general, we used to think that we're very logical, rational, and that we don't have any biases when we have to make the decisions. But studies show that we all experience biases every day. For example, some studies that we have looked into show that the brain can process up to 11 million bits of information every second. But our conscious mind can just process between 40 and 50 bits of information per second. That means that we have to keep making mental shortcuts every day to make these decisions. And let me put it from another angle. When we are making these quick judgments, we normally use assumptions and base these judgments on our cultural background, our personal experiences, our cultural and social stereotypes. And they're not just about gender, they are about any other visible characteristics such as ethnicity, body weight, height, names, anything that you can think that can trigger your unconscious biases. And as well, on another perspective, some studies have shown that organizations where biases are prevalent lack from diversity in the workforce, given the impacts that they have on the employee recruitment and employee retention. Therefore, I think we need to make a conscious exercise to make sure that we believe that we have those biases and that we try to change it in order to have a more diverse and efficient workforce. So today we're going to focus on those gender biases. And you will ask, well, why is this important for infrastructure? It's important because in our sector, in Latin America and the Caribbean, just the 13% of women of the workforce are women. So definitely infrastructure is not gender neutral. And as well, it's important to think that when we have to make decisions about infrastructure and demands and the services, as well, they're not gender neutral. We need to make sure that we represent the interests of minorities, of women, of the LGBTQI plus community, because they live different realities. To reflect on these issues, we have here today Caroline Leclerc, our Executive Director for Canada at the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you very much, Caroline. And let me start by saying that we're very impressed by your trajectory as a Canadian civil servant and the accomplishments of you in the government. And precisely because Canada is normally set as an example and best practice in the region, we would like to ask you, what has been your experience of unconscious biases in the workplace? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I'm quite happy to be here. I'm pretty sure that the number you quoted about our brain's capacity to integrate information was an average, because I'm pretty sure mine doesn't process that much info in one time. So let me try to address your question. I think I'll talk about my career in sort of the early phase and then the later phase when I became a manager. So I think we first have to acknowledge that everything around us is gendered from the moment we're born, right? Baby clothes are gendered, toys are gendered, the words we use with infants are gendered. A little girl is cute, a little boy is strong. So I actually grew up in an environment where I was pretty much brainwashed into understanding what my role in society would be and then in the workplace. So that's how I got into the workplace. And when I first started, I was in the public service first, and in the private sector first, and then in the public service, we did not talk about unconscious biases or diversity. We talked about pay equity, stereotypes, and work-life balance. And that was a bit of a catch-all to say, oh, you should go home, you have children. So the way I perceived what I know to have been biases, so they were, for example, comments about my behavior. So words are very important. So in performance reviews, I would be told that I don't have a poker face. I'm too transparent. I'm too emotional. I'm a bit abrupt. So I took that in. I thought perhaps there's something I should be doing about this. And as my colleagues on the board will tell you, still a bit emotional. Then they had different expectations for my ability at work. I was told in a room in a meeting after 5, oh, you should go home. You have children waiting for you. Well, they were men around the table the same age as me. They weren't told to go home to take care of the kids. Why was I expected? Why did they think I should be the one taking care of the kids? I didn't understand that. I didn't know what was going on. I also felt that my opinion did not matter much. I used to sit on a different board in an international organization that was majority of men, and I would make an intervention, and I thought, man, that was pretty good. And then a little while later, a man would make the same similar intervention, and then the person after would say, oh, I really agree with what Bob said. I was like, oh, and no one actually ever agreed with anything I said. The men just kept, oh, I'd like to build on what Peter just said. Oh yeah, and Paul, Peter, and Bob had this thing going where I felt like my opinion didn't matter. In that instances, I got with the 2 other women on the board, and then we agreed every time we would speak, we would actually build on what the previous woman had said. And we would do it even if she hadn't spoken, because you know what? The men wouldn't have noticed anyways. So I would say, oh, I really agree with what Linda just said. And then I would have to nuance it a bit because sometimes I didn't. But you sort of have to think about those strategies. I also had different promotional opportunities. Early in my career, I was part of a management development program. And that's the time when I had my children. So because I took parental leave, I didn't get the promotion at the end of the program. The men did because they didn't take the parental leave. So that's sort of, did I do anything about that? Not really. So my question, but I wasn't very successful at tackling some of those biases. And then the last decade happened. And I would say probably thanks to the emerging conversation around diversity and inclusion, we actually started talking about biases, unconscious biases, and privilege. And wow, that was for me extremely eye-opening. It's an extremely humbling experience because you sort of have to take a mirror and look at yourself and start acknowledging your privilege and your own biases. And I just want to take a little break here to say, one of the great gifts that we get as human is self-awareness. Let's use it. And with that comes a responsibility to educate ourselves, to learn, to look in the mirror and to constantly improve. And being part of society, there is a responsibility that comes with that as well, to actually show up as the best person we can be to make society as a whole better. So I believe that very strongly. So looking in the mirror for me, right? white woman, born in Canada, middle income family, free education, free health, but a francophone woman. So then I'm a manager and I see unconscious biases and discrimination in action. So what do you do about that? So something that's very important is that we all need to have zero tolerance for discrimination. You need to say something when you hear words that are discriminatory, when you see unconscious biases, you have to do something. We all have to take the training about unconscious biases. We should have safe spaces where we can have those difficult conversations. It's not easy to actually admit that you carry biases. I carried biases. I probably still do. And we need to be models for people around us. I should turn it back to you, take a break here.
Oh, thank you very much, Caroline. And it's incredible that, I mean, as you say, there's been a path in Canada in the last years. You have seen a change, but there's still a lot to do regarding gender and unconscious biases, even in like societies that are more aware of this. And one of the issues that are very that manifest these biases are the gender pay gap. We've seen some studies that show that mothers are less likely to be hired, and if they are, they offer low salaries than women without children. And in contrast, fathers or men with children are more likely to be hired than or offer higher salaries than men without children. In the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, we've seen as well that women with the same qualifications are offered between 5 and 30% less salaries than men. So what will be your recommendations for Latin America and the Caribbean to close the gender pay gap?
Let's not call them recommendations, just things I've noticed. So certainly you will see me in my current position. We have 5 minutes left. I'm a big fan of transparency. First, you need to collect the data. Then you need to share the data. And that's not the only thing you need to be transparent about. You need to be transparent about your practices. How do you go about determining the salaries of different persons? Also, something that I strongly argue for is that we should run a gender-based analysis of all of our compensation policies so that we understand upfront how they may impact women and men differently. You could find, for example, that women don't get rewarded as often as men when you use instant awards, for example. We should also make sure that we have a comprehensive set of policies that facilitate the presence of women in the workplace and their performance. So that's, for example, flexible work arrangements. But this will never be enough if we don't tackle the issue of the double burden that women carry. Because after a long day of work, women go home, they take care of the house, they take care of the kids, they take care of the parents. And that is work. That is work that is unpaid, and that is work that is under-recognized. So I'm also a big proponent of working with the care economy. It's a huge opportunity for us. And infrastructure, because it's so important for our household and our ability to get to work and our ability to work, could play an incredible role in terms of reducing the burden of care on women.
Yeah, that's very insightful, and kind of, I'm sure we all, some of us or lots of us, can see each other in that role. And another manifestation of these inequalities is the called glass ceiling, this invisible barrier that prevents women and minorities really to achieve senior positions in management in organizations. Studies in the region show that women in the region barely reach 20% of managerial positions in the government and less than 10% in the private sector. So I'm sure in the infrastructure, the numbers are even lower. So what will be your view or even what do you think needs to be done to break these glass ceilings?
So I think it starts with leadership and culture. So if you're in a management position, it's really on you to model that behavior of inclusiveness. And we should have principles of inclusiveness. For example, for when we manage meetings, we should tell people, you come in here, be self-aware, be conscious of your biases, make sure that you let other people speak. We should also, let me turn to my notes now. We should also, every manager should actually be responsible for mentoring and coaching someone. We should all be sharing our experience and making sure that we're helping people, we're helping raise them. And I'm really also a big fan of allyship. So you don't have to be a manager, actually. You see someone with a perceived difference around you, so be an ally. Help them find the opportunities. Help them benefit from the career development.
We only have some seconds left, but I don't want to leave without talking about imposter syndrome, because I think as well we all have this kind of unconscious, again, bias, and women, we still sometimes have the bias thinking that we don't deserve, or that we're not good enough, or what is famous phrase, we cannot have it all. So what it would be your advice for organizations to improve and help women feel that they belong and that they're entitled to it?
So imposter syndrome. So we all have this desire to fit in and to identify with the group within which we work. And it's really, really hard to resist. And you realize quickly you don't dress like them, you don't sound like them, you don't speak like them, you don't absorb the information the same way. I certainly don't absorb information in English the same way I do in French. So I often felt quite incompetent. And honestly, I also had people approach me when I became, in senior leadership. Well, she's the Francophone woman. She's filling a gap that we had in equity. That's how she got promoted. It wasn't because of merit. So be very careful when you talk about merit, because I can tell you that all the white men sitting around the table they're convinced they got there because of merit. So therefore, they've got merit right. And merit hides a whole bunch of systemic discrimination. So I encourage all of us to actually look at our staffing systems and make sure we remove the biases out of them. The schools we recruit from, the way we write the experiences, the questions we ask in those exams. And what was helpful for me is to identify to someone, find a model. And sometimes it was a woman that was a good leader, and I thought, oh, I could be like her. Or it was a man that could really acted in an inclusive way. And really, really, as managers, we all have the power to make everyone in our team feel competent and happy to be there. It's a smile. It's a thank you. It's a job well done. That's as simple as that. And then people just blossom and they're happy to show up at work. It's really not that complicated. Just go around with a smile. And if you have privilege, like I do, I think it's your responsibility to share your power and to help others.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And I hope we inspired you today to keep moving towards more equitable and more opportunities for women in the region. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria and Caroline, for this very enlightening conversation. Creo que todo lo que estuvimos conversando ahora nos lleva naturalmente a nuestro siguiente
All
panel,
of this, I think,
enfocado también en los temas
is a
de
segue into the
trabajo.
next panel, focusing on the labor market, talking about the challenges and strategies to attract and retain female workers in the infrastructure sector. To head this discussion, I'd like to invite Irene Arias Hoffman. She is the IDB Lab General Manager in the IDB Group, and she will be moderating the panel. In this panel, we'll be hearing about a practical vision and experience of specific actions in the different infrastructure subsector. So I'd like to invite Malena Galmarini, Chair of the Water and Sanitation Services in Buenos Aires, Nelson Reyes, Vice Minister of Transport of El Salvador, and Carla Zapata, General Manager of NLX. And virtually, we also have with us the Minister of Energy of Chile, Diego Pardo. Very briefly, before offering the floor to Irene, at the end of this panel, we'll have a Q&A session for those who are connected virtually. So please submit your questions during the panel. And for those who are in the room, please use the notepads we've made available to you. Irene, you have the floor. Good morning to all, and thank you very much to the infrastructure colleagues, Ariel, and the entire group for this invitation to moderate this panel. It's a wonderful panel because we don't frequently have the opportunity of hearing people who have so much knowledge from the sector, but furthermore, they have been leaders to promote ways in closing the gender gap from different perspectives. So allow me to first welcome Malena Galmarini, who is the President of Water and Sanitation of the City of Buenos Aires, with a history of promoting gender equality, and she'll be telling us about that. We also have with us Carla Zapata, who is the General Manager of NLX, who will give us the private sector perspective. And we have Nelson Eduardo Reyes from El Salvador, Vice Minister for Public Works and Transportation, and Diego Pardo, Minister of Energy of Chile. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today also. So let me welcome you all. To begin, why are we here talking about this topic? Well, first, it's an opportunity that we still have before us to promote greater female participation in work positions in the infrastructure sector of a higher level with higher pay, allowing women not only to have better work conditions, but furthermore allow them to provide greater diversity and new types of talent, which is what they bring to the sector. We can congratulate ourselves as a region to a certain extent because in a sector such as construction, we have seen a twofold increase of female workers in the sector, but we're talking about a twofold increase from 2 to 4%. When we compare this to other sectors where we've been present in other sectors in double digits, it shows how this sector is lagging. I mean, we may ask ourselves why, and this is what we want to explore in depth with the four panelists. Why? Why have we improved, but why is it that we have so much to do yet? Where are the opportunities? And as we heard from Director Leclerc, there are perhaps issues of prejudice or cultural biases that mean that women don't start out applying for certain positions. And this begins from early education, where STEM education in science and technology is still lagging, although we do have jewels in the region with some very innovative programs, such as In some countries, we have laboratorios creating new generations of women who could be in the technology sector. So it can be done, provided we see examples of working from the base, of creating the talent. But it's necessary to reinforce this talent building and addressing cultural issues at the same time, and also leadership positions in different enterprises. And I do believe that in President Elan's introduction and with our conversation with Director Leclerc, we've heard some of the reasons why there is still so much to do, but we're here for that and we want to work together to resolve it. So hopefully, through this conversation, we'll be able to draw some very specific ideas of actions that we can promote jointly. So let us start with hearing briefly from each of our panelists so that in about 3 minutes each, they can present their vision. Let us begin with Malena. Well, good morning to all. And thank you for this opportunity, Ariel, Sergio, Irene. You were just asking why women cannot reach en masse areas that have been considered traditionally male and why they traditionally have become male-dominated. As the president and the director pointed out, as well as Irene just now, it has a lot to do with cultural biases and with an early education. I would say practically from the moment we're born. When we're born on the room in the hospital where we're born, there's a sign put up or a little doll, and whether it's a boy or a girl, then the color will either be pale blue or pink. And this starts teaching us that there's a world for boys and one for girls. And when we're small, Father Christmas brings us different toys. Generally, for girls, the toys are associated with caregiving, and for boys, it has to do with productive development, development of work on the market. So I do believe what needs to be done is start to change the roots of our education and culture. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. And you said for us to introduce ourselves. Well, I'm Malena Galmarini. I'm 47. I have 2 children. On occasion, I told my girl, clear the table, help me wash the dishes. And I tell my boy, go and play outside, don't pester. And that is also teaching that the role for women is inside the house, taking care and providing care, and tell the boys, go outside because you bother us when you're in the house. For many years, I worked in an area in the province of Buenos Aires called Tigre. And there we were able to build a lot of innovative policies that today have become part of the policies of practically all the municipalities in Argentina. People have come from other countries to look into these policies. They are no longer innovative, but that's what's precisely so good to see them replicated elsewhere. But there's still a lot to be done. Change and transformation has to be cultural, and it has to be with everyone and for everyone. Well, thank you very much for those words, Malena. Let me now give the floor to Nelson. Thank you very much for the invitation and greetings to everyone. I do believe it's important to address and tackle this issue and to also incorporate it into infrastructure. Caridad pointed out earlier that a decade ago it was unthinkable to talk about infrastructure and gender and equity at the same time. But today we can talk about different initiatives or projects underway, showing that it doesn't remain at the level of a discussion at a panel or forum, but there are actually actions that are being implemented. In the Vice Ministry of Transportation and also representing the Ministry of Public Works, I can say that since the gender unit was created, in addition having that policy of gender equality, different diagnoses have been drawn up. We saw, for instance, that in leadership positions, and we do have 165 in our institution, we have 47 women holding these positions. Ana Maria Pinto, the head of the IDB transportation sector, spoke about the glass ceiling and how we can bridge this gap in leadership positions, especially in public sector institutions. She said that on average, only 20% of these positions are held by women. We have been trying to close the gap gradually. We know what's needed, but we are taking steps. And with these figures, we are perhaps reaching 29, 30% of women representation in leadership positions. We know it is important for them to be well represented at these decision-making levels, because on this basis, they can also reinforce implementation of gender equity policies throughout the institution. But it's also important to mention it's not only leadership positions, but also at all levels, especially when talking about infrastructure.
We see that in construction contracts, it's only 3.5% of women that have been hired within these contracts when we're talking about jobs, qualified jobs. And this number is 6.5% when we're talking about non-qualified jobs. We also see that there are so many challenges in order to move forward. And all of this, of course, as was mentioned earlier, has to do with a social construction, the paradigms that are built with different situations and differences in opportunities. If we compare statistics, we're talking about literacy within El Salvador. For example, we see that 12.7% of women do not read in the country as compared to 8.7%. If we compared the rates of high school graduates, we see that in Latin America and the Caribbean, men usually end their high school at 82% of them, as opposed to women. In the case of El Salvador, we go back to my country once again, we see that 47% of women participate in the work realm, whereas 81% of men participate in the work market. So we see that we have a number of structural issues and paradigms that make us think that the man is the one who can devote himself to tasks that sustain their family. And we see how the mind is programmed within women who believe that they should stay at home and should stay away from these jobs, especially when we're talking about non-traditional tasks as in construction, for example. Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. And now we're going to listen to a case study that tells us that you can do it. Carla has been many years in this group, and she received a prize as one of the entrepreneurs, one of the best entrepreneurs in Latin America and the Caribbean as an engineer within a sector where there is a huge gap, but you have bridged it. So tell us about your experience. Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. I wish to greet everyone. It's quite a pleasure to be here. I believe that out of the things that we can talk about as personal experiences, we can definitely supply a lot in this change and the transformation that we are trying to move forward. My name is Carla Zapata. I'm a Peruvian. I've been living in Chile for 18 years, but I also lived in Brazil and I also lived in Colombia. When I graduated from university, there was 100 women. There were very few women. 25 years ago, it's been a while, there was very few women who were able to study engineering, at least in my case. And I remember that I started in Peru, which is a very macho country. When I started working in 1996, there were only two women and 100 men. I was 22 years old. And as with all beginnings for women, especially in a male-dominated sector, it's always very difficult. But I think that it's also important to talk about resiliency. This is a word that we've been using quite a bit in the last few years, particularly in regards to women. I think that moving forward, going forward or backward, sometimes it's better to go back 2 steps to make 5 steps, to go 5 steps forward. So I think that as women, we have to understand our mindset. Sometimes we don't wish to take risks. A while ago, I talked with 50 women from the BHP company, the mining company, and we were talking about how to progress in our career. And of course, everybody said, what happens with our children? What happens with our family? This is a risk. I don't feel fully prepared in order to take up a responsibility or more responsibilities and leadership positions. So women have to be willing to take risks. We have to be mindful of the fact that when men see a position, they take risks, knowing 50% of the things that are within that position. Women do not take risks unless it applies to everything that they know. Today, I am one of the leaders in electromobility in Chile. We're talking about including electric buses. Do you think that I knew anything about all this, or 100% of so-called electromobility? Maybe you could think that that was a position that was better for men, talking about cars, speed, autonomy. However, women do learn, and they learn very quickly. And we are able to place these topics within the very core of the company or the table. And I believe that women's diversity, but I also believe that incorporating all this in companies, women, particularly women who are capable, and different women from different nationalities, being able to conjugate women and diversity, I have to say this is a great addition to companies. My personal experience is that the more women we have, the richer the conversation, particularly if we are private companies, energy companies, because we are going through important transformations. And today, energy companies are taking care of the environment. We are going through just transitions. We're talking not only about the posts or the cables, we're talking about the photovoltaic sector. We're talking about electromobility. So having more and more women who are part of these careers entail a structural topic. What we were saying earlier happens because we create this mindset in women. They're not geared towards STEM careers, but beyond structural issues, I believe we have to teach professionals to take risks. We have to teach women that not necessarily do they have to be 100% prepared in the topics of their job. That can be learned. Flexibility is important. Yes, of course, we're talking about hybrid systems, but that entails talking about salaries. We're talking about flexibility, the flexibility of being able to work from home. There's so many things that have been changing over the last 20 years that should generate the opportunities for more and more women to become part of the labor market. So the transformation that we're living, not only within the energy and water sector, entails women that are part of these companies, become a part of these companies. Let's share these images. They're all friends, they're all colleagues at work, and there's so many of them, as you can see in these pictures. As I said, there were 2 of us when I started. Today, there's 25%. Yes, you might say this is not very much, but it was about 10% at the time, particularly. I mean, we were assistants, mostly we were secretaries, but today we are women who are leaders, who are where their helmets. They're working in engineering, and you can see how the companies start changing, and this makes me extremely happy. Thank you for that optimism, which is well founded. Now let's go to the minister. I believe you have a video to share with us, so thank you kindly for being with us. It's quite a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to be there with you in person. I would like to apologize because we have an emergency here in Chile, and I have to be mindful of a region that is going through an emergency. I will be coming soon to Washington. But an important part of what we're doing at our ministry has to do with sensitizing people to women in the energy sector. We have a communications campaign that includes the two axes in our government, sustainability and technology, as well as the gender gap. I want to talk to you about the topics that have to do with the gender gap with a small video, a short video, which I'd like to show you. I believe that an image is much more eloquent than 1,000 words. Let's start then with these 2 women. Let's start with the story of these 2 women. Well, yes, and need sometimes makes us act. Isn't that so? I had to start working, and within the forests, and this provides us with. We have to start working within this area, within these hectares that we have, and this came up, and the owner of this field said, well, okay, then you have to start digging. I said, fine. I wasn't sure about what I was doing, but I learned. My name is Denise. I work in ENAP, ENAP. I'm in charge of the operational sector of our company in Egypt, in Cairo. This has been a great challenge. Of course, this has to do with the relationship that I have with the authorities. And of course, all of these people are men, no women. At the beginning, I thought that this was going to be more difficult, but I see that the mindset is opening, and we're starting to see more women in a higher responsibility. There have been greater challenges because, of course, there's a preponderance of men who have another culture. And of course, I've had to make the necessary adjustments, but the challenge at the same time has been very interesting. Thankfully, I'm up to 53 men who work under me. All we did was sell. Thankfully, now we have a very large clientele, And with time, you start reaching your aims and you start understanding what you're doing with great effort. The challenge has been extremely interesting. It has attracted a series of very good results, at least in my work life here in Egypt. This is a campaign that we've organized, and this is a summary of the last 2 chapters. We want to talk about women who are leaders in different sectors. I think that I'd like to start talking about some anecdotes. And here is a graph of public policies in this area. In Denise's case, when I went to Egypt, we had been to the COP meetings, and I went to our ENAP offices in Egypt. I met all of the workers who were working there. Of course, Egypt is a society in which women have very large difficulties to access jobs. But I was surprised to see many female engineers. They were planning, they were doing all the planning of the operations. And I started speaking with one of them. She spoke no Spanish. Obviously, she spoke Arabic. She didn't speak much English. So with a very rudimentary English, I asked her, so how is it that you were able to start working here? What is your history? What brought you here? And she said, Denise, as I said, she spoke very broken English. And she said, but Denise knows what it means to create a safe work environment. So we're not talking about nationality differences here. This was a Chilean woman who hired an Egyptian woman. But the fact that there was a woman in charge made it easier to understand the work itself, and there was a more inclusive workspace compared to the other offers that she had received when she graduated from engineering school. So I think that this is one of the biggest objectives in public policy. We have to break the ice. We see that the space is opening up, and this is what generates change. In the case of Elizabeth Alfaro, the engineer in the first part of our video, she explained this at the beginning, how she started working as a woodcutter in the wood industry, in the timber industry, and how she started working within forest management. At the end of the day, this is a very dynamic sector which is exposed to climate change. And what comes in the future is something very uncertain. What the best decisions are, we have to make that kind of decision. Therefore, we need very much innovation in the sector. So if we look at the literature is very clear about this. Creativity always is there in diverse environments, in the professional realm, in the socioeconomic realm, in the history of life, in the background, and particularly in gender. I like her story because this is a very masculine environment. It's an environment dominated by men. She brought in a very different perspective, which is what allowed her to have a timber industry that was very successful in Chile. Now let's talk about numbers. The first thing we did in our ministry, this is an institutional task that transcends me, was to go back to 2018 and come up with information. The information on female participation, which was only 23% in the energy sector, it's quite low. It's very far from the equality that we're looking for, the parity that we're trying to find, that we're trying to achieve, because what we're looking at, what we're aiming at, of course, is 50-50. In this year, there were certain aspects that were worrisome because in terms of higher responsibility of managerial jobs, it was 17%. And so the stories of Carla and Ana Maria in Chile are important stories. And at the level of operations, it was also very low. And that's where we had less women. So this informs us. I would ask you kindly to please move the slides forward when you think it's appropriate. But here, what you can see is that essentially this is a challenge in public policies. First of all, it's very important to have the basic information with which to start working. We started with these numbers. In the case of our ministry, we realized that we needed about 50% of parity, but we're close to 40. This work that we're doing in energy and women in our public policy is initially volunteer work, and each sector defines its ambition and its contact with women. What we're trying to do is have a link which is mostly a qualitative link. What we're trying to do is trying to teach it for the test. We see these groups of people within the managerial section, and then we see the operational sector, which is mostly male. And of course, we have to try to be mindful of the type of work. We want to make sure that all of these sectors reflect the diversity of our society. This is what we should try to aspire to. This is our energy program, and we have the quantitative and qualitative links. Today we have 70 companies. We're trying to reach 100 this year. And here we have a number of dimensions. For instance, one of them is the green hydrogen one, where we're trying to include this dimension of affirmative policies. We're trying to create an industry where we have renewable energy and refineries, but we still don't have this quite down. So we want to make the most of this opportunity in order that include more women, because otherwise it'll be more difficult. I think that I've gone beyond the 3 minutes that I was allowed. Thank you so much for listening to me. You can download the Energy Women report that we have. Thank you, and all of our solidarity with Chile at this time. We do hope that with the fires that you're going through right now, I know that it's going to be very difficult. I'm sure that now you have to go and tackle all that, but we wish you all the best. Malena, let's go back to you. We'd like to understand, how do you go from policies to reality, and how do you introduce innovation? Because I'm part of the IDB Innovation Lab. What the minister said is truly music to my ears. So how can we go to the practical side of things? We can do this with by trying to avoid biases and prejudice. And this requires commitment. It's not the same thing to have 50% of women, and for those women not to be feminist. Being a woman is a necessary condition, but it's not enough. We too are born and grow up in a world that demands that we become masculinized. And I'd like to talk about this a little further with Carla. How much more can we ask women? I'd also ask this to the minister. He was talking about Luisa's story, the timber worker. Says, I don't really know how I'm here, she was saying, and then she did it. But there's always behind these women, there's something that is part of womanhood in the sense that they devote themselves to being women. So what we have to do is open up that space for them, for women. 50% of the matrix in all countries in the world of the production matrix is made up by women. Therefore, equality should be more than a dream. It should be a goal for each and every one of us. So we want to make sure that we do this with commitment. It's not enough with leadership. Let me give you a personal anecdote. When I arrived at the company that was identified by Carla, I remember that the chairman, Mr. Fernandez, said, well, we would like you to be the president at AISA. 4 days before being hired, 4 men came up to me. They said, well, this is how you have to manage our staff, the personnel. Well, of course, I didn't know anything about water and sanitation, but within the 3 years that I've been working, we have done 4,000 kilometers of network, more than in the entire history of this company, in the 17-year history of this company. Again, I'd like to take up what the minister who was talking about the Egyptian company. We have to make sure that we build safe spaces for women. This means building, first of all, being appointed. If we're not appointed, we're not going to exist. This is why we build the non-sexist guide for the company. This seems like a minor issue, but it's not. We all have to learn that all of us, men and women, are there. Secondly, we have to have protocols to face violence. I'm talking about violence within the workplace, but within the home space as well. My workers, not only the female workers, not only at work, but at home, if they're going through a situation of physical violence, of abuse, psychological violence, of course, they're going to be less productive within the company. Aside from the fact that this is a woman who is suffering, it's very important to understand what is going on with that woman outside of the workspace. We also work with economic violence. Many women are in charge of their families. It was mentioned earlier, Irene, Director Leclerc mentioned this. So what happens with your children when you go to work? Nobody asks my husband, who is today is the Minister of the Economy in Argentina. Nobody asks him, what happens to your children when you go to work? No one asks him. So again, I would ask, why are we so exacting on ourselves? And we see that there are many women who are alone with only one-parent families. And we start asking them, well, if they're part of the company, they can't pay their alimony, they can't pay support because they are working. So this is another important thing. We had to work on this. We had psychoeducational workshops, because working with violence doesn't mean that you're only working with women. You have to work with men as well. If we only concentrate on women, that violent male is going to find another woman. So you have to work on both aspects. A few years ago, we used to say it's very difficult to talk about infrastructures and women, and we hardly spoke about abusive males. When we spoke about this, that there was hardly any budget, and we had to devote this to women. Today, we're working with men as well in order to save lives. In Argentina, there is feminicide every day, and it's a very high rate. So we believe that it's very important to work with males in our company, AISA. We did grow in this sector. We have been doing those exercises with the IDB, and the percentage is very high of women in such a male-dominated company. We're talking about 24% at this time. We were 15%, but at this time we're 24. So again, we have to understand what measures have to be taken in order to attract that talent and take care of that talent. We have to show them that they can grow. We have to show them that they can flourish, as somebody mentioned earlier, that they can give all of themselves, that they do have those abilities. The company will support them. The company will ask them to take risks, but mostly the company will support them, not push them to take risks. They have to take risks because they do have a network. Many times we don't take risks because we don't know what the result of that risk is going to be. And many times, unfortunately, in the world, the risks that are taken by women end their life. So within AISA, we're trying to work on all these issues. We want to fill the gap. We want to fill the salary gap, and it's so much more profound than understanding how much males make, how much females make. We want to make sure that we have this responsibility. This is a very important part of our life, and males don't have to worry as much about this. We're there to support them, as I said, and we want to make sure that this is happening. We want to fill this gap because not so much, I mean, how much you're paid is important, but what expenditure do you have as a woman? If on a monthly basis, we have to take this into account. For instance, if we're talking about menstruation, about their period, of course, they're getting 650 pesos, so they're making less than their male counterpart.
So we would need to come up with a management format that will allow women to manage their menstruation cycle. So we need to understand and examine these biases to be able to ensure that human resources and the hiring of human resources doesn't take into account their sexual orientation. And this has many connotations. That is, women feel a lot more secure when they don't have to include their name, their age, when no one asks them if they are of childbearing age, whether their children are in grade school or high school or university. I think that there are many things that can be done. We're also working on our supply chain in conjunction with vendors and hiring companies, and we ask them, like us, to engage greater flexibility with the appropriate amount of tolerance. When we see any gender-based violence towards women or against trans people, then we also need to impose this zero tolerance policy. And those who are capable of assaulting or addressing other people in a violent way need to be subjected to this zero tolerance policy. And lastly, I think we've been taking this far beyond a company. In our company, we have 7,500 employees, both men and women. That's more people than what many municipalities in Argentina employ. that our particular universe of users, both men and women, numbers about 15 million people. So if we start to reform ourselves from within as a company, with these people that work for us, we will be able to also help transform the society that's around us. Well, thank you very much for not only providing the concrete examples of the application of the policy, but you offered us a completely comprehensive view of how to do this. We're going to go in a certain order, but I'd like to give Minister Pardo an opportunity, especially since you mentioned the case of Elizabeth Alfaro and how she dared do what she did. And I'd like to give the minister the opportunity to respond before he has to leave us.
No, mira, yo estoy muy de acuerdo con la visión que
Well, I
se
think
presentó
I
desde el panel.
agree with the
Esto
vision that
siempre
has been expressed in the
como
panel.
un arma de doble filo, uno trata
This can be a double-edged sword to a certain
de
extent.
alguna
We
manera
try to, in
destacar
a certain way,
estas historias de
highlight
estos esfuerzos
these
que se vienen detrás.
stories
Pero al mismo
of
tiempo no son exigibles a todo el mundo. Las
all of
políticas
these
públicas no tienen que estar pensadas
experiences.
en
But
heroínas, digamos, tienen
we
que estar
need
pensadas en
to, when we
personas
do policy
comunes
making,
y
we need to
corrientes.
be able to think about
En la historia de
heroines.
Elizabeth, nosotros lo que queríamos destacar
And
de
with the
alguna manera,
case of Elizabeth,
incluso con un
we
ambiente
wanted
totalmente
to
adverso y a pudo, digamos. La
highlight that
nuestra
even in the
responsabilidad
environment
como
that
gobierno era
surrounded her, we needed to
hacer
be able
políticas
to
públicas para personas
ensure that
comunes y corrientes, y
she
no como
stood
heroínas
out. And that
como
when we
Elizabeth,
do public
que lo es, así
policy
también creo
making,
que
we
no hay
need to be able to
ninguna
account
diferencia en la apreciación.
and
Aquí simplemente
appreciate
estamos intentando destacar esa historia, pero en
these
ningún caso
stories.
ponerla como el modelo
But
de las políticas
we're not
públicas
trying to
que estamos tratando de implementar.
necessarily use her as
Efectivamente,
the
yo con
only
eso
model for policy
me
making that
quiero
we're
despedir.
trying to do.
Le
With
agradezco
that,
sus
I will
presentaciones a los demás
take my leave of
exponentes
you. I'd like to thank
y
all
muchas
of the
gracias por tenernos aquí. Espero que la
presentations
próxima
or
vez
the presenters for their
podamos
respective
reunirnos aquí.
presentations, and it was a real pleasure to join you today.
Gracias.
Thank you very much,
Viceministro Nelson.
Minister.
Cuéntenos entonces en el caso de El Salvador, y
Now,
en particular
Minister
el
Nelson,
Ministerio de Obras
when you
Públicas y
talk about the
Transporte,
El Salvador and
¿cómo
the
se
Ministry
lleva
of
una
Public
política
Works and
pública a la
Transportation,
práctica?
how
¿Cuáles
do
han
you
sido algunas
take
de las
public
experiencias
policy and put
que
it
puedes
into
compartir?
practice? What types of experiences can you share with
Sí,
us?
como mencionaba,
Yes,
pues
as it
uno de
was
los
previously
principales temas a
mentioned,
destacar y lo que
one of the
hace una
key
común
items
de
for us
todas
to
también en la
highlight in
institución
the before and
es
after
tanto
of
la
an
creación
institution
de la
relates
política de
both to
igualdad
the
y equidad de
creation
género
of
como la
gender
conformación
equity
de la unidad de género, que se
policies
encarga de
as well as training
transversalizar todo
in
este
those
enfoque
arenas. So we
a lo
try
largo de toda
to
la institución.
approach this from a
Vemos que se pueden
cross-cutting
implementar
perspective
políticas que
throughout
ya se
the
están siguiendo
organization.
dentro
We
del
see
ministerio.
the implementation
Como
of
bien lo
certain
mencionaba,
policies
que no haya ningún
that are
tipo de
already taking
distinción a la hora
place
de contratar, que
and
hombres y
taking
mujeres
effect in the
tengan
ministry. We want for
iguales
men
oportunidades
and women to
a la
have
hora de aplicar un puesto
equal access to
y que no se
opportunities when
determine que para un
applying
puesto en
for a
específico
position.
se necesita un
And we
hombre
don't
y
want
una mujer.
to
Esto
specifically
también se
state that certain
aplica no
jobs
solo a
require
puestos
the
administrativos, es
uh,
muy importante que para los puestos de
only men
liderazgo
or only
también
women.
sea
Part of the
implementado, pero
leadership
también
component
en los
not
puestos
only addresses
operativos
the
no calificados, porque
making of the
comúnmente se habla
policies, but
de
we
hay
also
que
want to be
reducir la
able to
brecha
implement these on the
de
ground.
la
So
participación de las
we want
mujeres
to
comparado con los
close the
hombres
gender
en
gap
carreras
in terms
como
of
las STEM.
female
Y está
participation
bien, hay que
versus
hacerlo,
males,
pero
especially,
¿cuánto
for
puede
example,
llevarnos
say
realizar ese
in
tipo de cambios
STEM
estructurales? ¿Un año, 5 años, una
spaces.
década?
But we also
Y
need
está
to
bien, no
attach
digo
a
que no se tenga que
certain
hacer, se
time
tiene que
frame.
hacer,
How
pero nos
much time do you
confrontamos
need
ante una
to
realidad
implement this? 5 years,
bastante a
10
vistas
years?
claras en países
But we
como
need to
América
also
Latina,
face a
donde
reality
hoy, no
in
en un año
Latin
ni una
America, where
década,
today
sino
it's not
hoy
going to happen in
existen
1 year
muchas
or in
familias
a decade
que
from now.
carecen de
But
una figura
today,
paterna,
many
que es el
families
que
don't
la
have the
madre,
father
la que
figure, and
tiene que
it's
llevar
the
las riendas del
mother
hogar,
who
la
has
que
to
tiene que llevar
be
el sustento, que
the
contrasta
head of
con este
household,
paradigma
that
que se tiene,
is
que
the
son los
sole
hombres los que tienen
provider
que
for the family.
realizar las tareas
And it would
que
then be
mejor remuneradas o que tienen algún tipo de
inconsistent
remuneración,
for
y son las
men
mujeres las que
to
tienen que
be the ones who
destacarse en
have
tareas más
access to the
domésticas.
best paid
Entonces, si
jobs and
tenemos esta
only women
realidad,
have to have the duty of taking care of the household. So clearly, we have to close the gender gap in STEM education and opportunities, but we also need to open up the broad assortment of opportunities that exist in the overall labor market and make them more accessible to women. And it's true that many potential employers believe that women don't have the knowledge. Many women themselves think that they don't have the necessary knowledge to fill those positions, but we need to create the adequate conditions to overcome this. We've been implementing a quota, for example, for female representation in construction contracts. We also have some partner organizations that have very large highway contracts, so we can start to ensure that the gender equity component is included. 61% of these small and medium-sized businesses have women as leaders, and many of these women are heads of household, and this is reflected especially when we talk about recruiting personnel and staff that is used to be able to carry out, say, different activities like highway maintenance work. Now, for some time, this was not seen as a traditional role for a woman, but this creates an opportunity for women to be able to earn a living and take care of their families. This year, for example, we're going to begin the bidding process for the Los Chorros Highway contract bid. It's worth more than $300 million. It's one of the largest highway projects in our country. And part of the process involves a requirement that obliges the contracting of at least 10% females to be able to get the contract. So this creates some concern among companies who think that this is going to require an added cost. But what we try to say is that this is not just something that may, in fact, cost a little bit more, but it's necessary for society. And in terms of benefits, we want to ensure that these women have more opportunities to be able to fill those positions. Thank you very much
casos tan concretos
for
y
sharing all of these
también
very specific cases.
un poco como lo que compartiste antes,
And
Malena,
just
creo que
getting back to what
también
you mentioned previously, Malena,
nos hace
I
ver
think
que
that you've
la
helped us see that
transformación desde cada uno de sus ámbitos puede
transformation
tener
from
un
each one
efecto
of your
multiplicador
particular spaces can, in
en
fact,
el
have a
resto
multiplying effect
en
that
muchas
can
otras personas fuera
permeate
en el caso
other
del ministerio,
arenas
mucho más allá
and
puede
impact
tener
a
ese
greater
impacto y es
number
un
of
cambio
people
de
beyond
cultura,
your
de mindset,
ministries. And
¿no?
it's all about
Gracias
changing the
por
culture
compartir
and the
eso.
mindset.
Carla,
Thank you for
desde el
sharing
ámbito
that.
de NL,
Carla,
y tienes
from
los principios de
your
empoderamiento de la
environment,
mujer,
you have the
¿verdad?
principles of empowering
Cuéntanos un poco
women.
sobre eso
Can
y
you tell us a little bit about that
cómo lo
and
aplicas
how do you apply
en la
that
práctica.
in
Gracias.
practice? Thank you. Yes, just being practical, I think the first thing that we need to do is look at the commitment from the upper leadership, which is what you were mentioning before. If we don't have a sincere commitment on the part of leadership, that we don't just talk about things, but that we walk the walk. Many times we say a lot of things, but when we have to act, we don't do what we said we were going to do. And we've engaged in an important effort in that regard to define certain things that need to happen. For example, the first thing, in any recruiting process, there has to be a woman always in the consideration for any position. And that's a definition that was made at the outset. And at first, it seemed to be something that was forced, and it may have been a forced issue at the time. But when we oblige our contracting offices to ensure that women are applying for jobs, it went from a forced situation to a naturally occurring thing. Secondly, the companies need to have a career path available for women. And this needs to exist for men as well. But it's important for us to say that we can support these women for succession plans. Every leader in a company needs to have at least 6 people that can take their role once they move on. There need to be 3 on the list that are ready to assume the role and 3 others that need some training or may need to be groomed for the position. And at least a number of those people need to be women. And it may be women that are already visible, that have certain skills and certain connotations. We can add them to this succession plan. We can groom them to assume leadership roles. Thirdly, nowadays, especially in Chile, and I imagine that this happens in other countries as well, competition to capture or recruit professional women is extremely difficult. We are fighting for the women that are already in the industry. Unfortunately, as we were saying before, there are very few women engineers or scientists. When we talk about technology and data sciences, the recruitment of women becomes a rather complex situation when you try to recruit women and you try to hire them. Nowadays, women are better prepared to negotiate. Therefore, we are getting more skills, and nowadays there are many methodologies to see how your income is operating, but we need to understand where we are positioned in the market, not too high, not too low, but we do need to know what the benchmark is. And so this benchmark concept is very important for us. Another thing is that many things are done for money. At the end of the day, both men and women are looking for the same things. We want training, development opportunities, flexibility in our work hours or work schedules. Nowadays, we are talking about changing schedules, say from the start time of 8:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. So if we want to incorporate more women, we need to consider these things. Speaking on about my case in particular, I have to take my kids to school every morning before I go to the office. So this requires some measure of flexibility. And there are other factors that are not so reliant on the money issue. And many women that find their place in companies stay there. And so we're doing something right. We have very little turnover for women, and if we start with professional women that become more skilled and become leaders in their own right, important leaders for the company, visible leaders, that could be a really good way to go. Now, getting back to gender violence, we're talking about leadership now, but companies that are primarily male dominated always worked that the strongest man was always right. Now, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to drive forward is this cultural exchange to get away from the largest and loudest voices and get back to a much more dignified way of considering people. There are certain connotations that a leader has to have, and not all of us may have all of these skills or these characteristics, but we need to be able to train leaders. And lastly, another thing that I think it's interesting to share is the postnatal issue or the prenatal issue. In Chile, we have 6 months, and with the prenatal, we're talking about 7.5 months of women that are away from the company because they had a baby. So we're trying to push to ensure that the care afforded to the baby is not just the role of the mother, but also of the father. So in Chile, it's always designated to the mother, but many fathers look to try and provide coverage for 3 out of those 7.5 months. And another thing that we're driving forward is to allow men to be able to make decisions that will allow them to help their women in the home. Because when you talk about this topic with colleagues, the postnatal care issue is always a headache. And many times companies have to subsidize the absence of the women. But women can also be supported by men who take a role in taking care of the child at home. So I'm lucky to have a marvelous husband, and or rather, he helps me in everything. And he helps me just an enormous amount. But in order for us to move forward, we need to be able to pick a good partner first. And I think that's something that's absolutely fundamental for anybody who aspires to have an upper leadership position or a professional career. Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes. Let's give some of the folks who are joining us today the opportunity to pose their questions. So if anybody wants to come up to a microphone and ask a question, please do so.
Ok. Bueno, vamos a tomar una entonces de la audiencia virtual.
Let's go first to our virtual audience first.
Nos están escribiendo, bueno, voy a desde Costa Rica.
Let's go to Costa Rica.
gracias.
Eduardo, thank you.
Siempre he tenido una inquietud y
I've
quisiera
always
un
had
comentario de
a
dos
doubt, and
panelistas
I
al
wanted
respecto.
to hear a
¿Cómo
comment
cambiar de
from the panelists in
pensamiento
this
en el
regard. How do you
sentido de que el
change
talento
the thought
femenino
process
vale
in the
y
sense that
no
female
se debe
talent
de ver
is
a través de la
valuable
comparación con el
and it
talento
shouldn't be
masculino, sino
seen through the
que
lens or
vale por
comparative
capacidad del
lens
ser
with
humano, sin importar el
the
género?
male talent?
Porque habéis tocado algo en
And
este tema.
this deals
Puede
more
dar
with
pie
human
también a
capability without
algunos mensajes
the issue of gender.
de cierre,
And this
porque creo que habéis
can
tocado
lead
mucho el
to
tema del
many
mindset aquí
closing
y creo que
comments.
nos habéis
We
dado
did mention the whole mindset
muchas buenas
component
indicaciones de
on
cómo,
various occasions
lo estáis
here,
llevando a la
and
práctica
you've
y de
given
qué
us a
hay
lot
detrás
of
de estas
ways in how you're
estadísticas de
taking
mejora, que nos falta mucho por
the process to overcome these biases and putting them in practice. So the drivers behind the statistics in this regard are clearly evident, but when we talk about this question, Malena,
Eduardo, me dijiste
yes,
que
Eduardo
compañero. Bueno,
is the name
Eduardo,
of the colleague. Yes, Eduardo.
a ver, la primera cuestión es que
The
todos
first matter is that we all
trabajadores y
want
trabajadoras capaces.
capable
Todos
employees,
buscamos
both men and women. We're
los
all
mejores y
looking
las
for the
mejores
best
para
men and the
trabajar
best
en nuestras
women
empresas.
to work for our companies.
El problema
The
de la
problem
comparación entre
with
la
the
capacidad
comparison
de los varones
of
o de las
skills
mujeres, o
between
esto
men
de
and women,
no mirar mucho
or not
qué
really
identidad,
looking at
qué sexo tienen,
identity
tiene que ver
issues
con una cancha
or their
inclinada. Yo soy muy
sex. It
futbolista.
has to do with
Espero que Eduardo también, porque es una buena
less
forma de
than
explicar. Si uno juega un partido
fair
de
playing
fútbol
field.
11 contra
I'm a
11,
fan of football. If I play a game
pero
of
la
football, it's
cancha
11 players
está
against
un
11
poquito
players. But if
inclinada para
the
un lado,
field is slightly
entonces
slanted
el árbitro
in favor of
seguramente
one side,
tendrá que tomar
then the
algunas
referee
medidas
may have
para que la
to
cancha
undertake
vuelva a
some
estar
measures to
pareja para ambos
level the
equipos.
playing field for both
Cuando
teams.
nosotros
So
hablamos
when
de
we
las
talk
acciones
about
afirmativas
affirmative
y hacemos
actions
estas cosas que
and we
disfrutamos en el
do some
panel,
of these things, we
tiene
engage
que
in
ver
some
con
of these
eso.
activities that
Las
we've already
mujeres
mentioned in the
empezamos
panel,
el partido con
that
la
all
cancha
has to do
inclinada.
with that particular
Siempre
point. Women
estamos
are
más
used to
abajo
a
por
slanted
un montón de
playing
razones.
field, and they're
Razones que
always
hemos
on the wrong
expuesto
end for a variety
ahí,
of
que se
reasons.
pueden
Many of them
encontrar
have been
seguramente en la
highlighted here.
web
You can find this
del BID,
on the
también en la
IDB
web de
website.
los espacios
You can
que
find this
lideramos,
on the websites of the various spaces
pero
that
es
we
necesario
direct.
que balanceemos esa cancha.
But it's
Después sí busquemos
not
en las capaces y en las capaces.
necessary to try
Pero no
and
puede
level
ser
the
que
playing
en una
field right
empresa,
away. We need
digo,
to
para
try
poner
and look
mi
at the
ejemplo
most
y no
capable
irme
human talent
a otro
available, be
lado,
they
una
men
empresa
or
donde
women.
hay 7.500
But we have a
trabajadoras,
company with
trabajadores,
7,500 employees.
haya solamente un
It,
24% de
it's
personas
not
capaces de ser parte.
possible that we only have
Allí lo que hay son otro
24%
tipo de
of a
barreras.
particular type of person
Son estas
represented.
tareas
And clearly there
masculinizadas,
are other types of barriers.
estos
Many of these
estereotipos, sesgos
positions
de género,
have
que no le
stereotypes,
permiten a las
gender
mujeres entrar,
biases,
que
they're
no le
very
permiten,
masculinized, and these
eligen
essentially keep women out. They
personal,
don't let
elegir
the
mujeres.
decision makers
Yo, un
select
ejemplo,
women.
a ver, primera cosa, ¿cómo se resuelve
So
con la corresponsabilidad?
getting back to the
Corresponsabilidad
first
en
part of the
empleado.
question, how do
Nosotros
you
no
assume
solamente
the
ampliamos
responsibility to
las
change this?
licencias para los hombres que se
Now we
convierten en
can
padres,
extend
sea
the
por hijos biológicos, sino también por adopciones,
leave
también
permissions for
por,
men to also take leave in
perdón,
the
tratamiento de
case of any
fertilidad,
birth.
por, bueno, por un montón de
And there are
razones,
other
pero además
circumstances, for
tenemos
example, women
las
getting
licencias por cuidados. ¿Qué quiere decir esto?
fertility
Nosotros
treatments and what have you.
pedimos que
But
los
what we
trabajadores
want at the end
varones
of the day is
acompañen
that
a sus hijos,
male
no a sus mujeres,
employees
no
support
a
their
sus mujeres,
children, not
a sus hijas,
necessarily
hijos
their
e hijas.
wives. We want the male employees to support their children, take them to the doctor, the pediatrician, take them to school, be present when they graduate from the university. We want to provide accesses to men to those spaces where they are normally not seen. And as Carla was saying, we need to create these spaces to ensure a better link with their children. Mothers need to stop being the intermediaries when we talk about the family links between fathers and their children. So if this was just a matter of capacity and skills, going back to the meritocracy that was mentioned previously, then you could infer perhaps incorrectly that women are not sufficiently capable, and that's why we don't climb much higher in the ranks. Well, this takes us to a question about stereotypes posed by Valeria, and I'd like to give Sergio the opportunity to pose his question. Thank you. Congratulations for all of your presentations. Malena, thank you for joining us. And it's wonderful to see firsthand the president of the bank. Malena is a gender champion, and not just recently, but for a long time now. My question is as follows. As a bank, we try to support many different topics, and sometimes we see changes in the administration and the leadership. And I think you said quite correctly, in fact, that we'll take one step forward and two steps back. And so from the bank standpoint, how can we provide better support, or how should we support you in particular in your efforts to ensure that all the gains that you've managed to acquire so far are not susceptible to any setbacks? Okay, we are firmly committed to ending this part of the program right at 11. So please answer that question, Malena, and if you could also talk about how we could work as partners to drive this throughout the region, and then I'll yield the floor to Minister Carla. I think that there's a main access here. We need to collaborate with institutions and organizations and create networks. When I talk about everything that we've done in ISA, it wasn't done by Malena, it was done by a team. It was done by a work group, a work team that brought together, collected, shared, and made a commitment to cultivate allies and partners within the organization at the institutional level. But I think this goes a step further. We are experiencing, after this wave of feminism that we've seen in recent years, we've seen a retraction by women. And on the other hand, the progress made by the right and the left, or the extreme right or the extreme left, have had a great impact in women's rights. So we need to be able to create a space and generate the adequate spaces in institutions and organizations, and cultivate relationships with other women leaders to create this network that will help push back this retraction in human rights, but also in women's rights. We need to be very cautious, very cautious. Humanity is going through a very difficult time right now. And there is a portion of society, especially at the leadership levels, in the political arena, in the corporate arena, in the union arena, and the third sector, that believe that we have to go back to a male-dominated situation. And after so many centuries of this, now is the time to highlight the strength that women have, and we need to do this to ensure the protection of our rights. I think all democratic institutions, multilateral organizations, as well as national governments and subnational governments, international organizations from the third sector, and each one of us as individuals, as human beings, have to protect these rights that ensure humanity's well-being. I think that one of the most effective ways for us to ensure that these efforts withstand the test of time and bring about the impact that they should is improving the institutionality of all of these organizations. When we talk about policy making at the ministry level and what we're trying to do, this is rather recent. We started with this in 2015, and we've seen how this has been sustained over time. And in fact, some of these initiatives are garnering strength and are expanding and diversifying. And we believe that this has been one of the best things that we could have looked at, especially in this topic. And we need to continue betting on improving the institutions in that regard. I think that as a bank, you can continue to provide support. We know that in the public sector, the issue of limited resources is always present. And in that basic topic, it's not that I want to put in a plug or anything, but any kind of technical assistance or financial assistance is more than welcome. And I think that this could be very helpful to be able to support these types of initiatives. From my standpoint, in Chile, the IDB has been contributing enormously to infrastructure projects. In particular, I see this when we deal with transportation issues, and there are many opportunities. And I think that if in Latin America and the Caribbean region, we didn't have an infrastructure that has the capability to offer quality of life to its citizens, then it will be very difficult to bring about these aspirations of incorporating women into the current modern world. When we try to implement an electric bus project at the present time and we start seeing more women drivers behind the wheel of these buses, then we will be slowly but surely changing the lives of people. And so if the IDB continues to intervene in these innovation projects, this will keep moving forward. Many pilots don't ascend to the larger scale level, and many great ideas are lost. In many cities, we have smart cities programs, but what does it cost for us to create these smart cities? So I think that the work that you do with the private and the public worlds, in addition to all of us who are here, we can try and fight for ensuring that we see more infrastructure projects in Latin America. And lastly, something that we've also mentioned previously is how do we strengthen our institutions in such a way that the career path is something that we start trying to instill in our children? And the idea would be to inspire both girls and boys from 2 to 6 years of age that are about to maybe uh, get out of school at a certain level and they still don't know what they want to do. So we could be more decisive and work more closely together to instill these types of mindsets in our children. Well, I think that this call of action in favor of greater innovation and fostering all the talent that we can is something that those of us at IDB and IDB Invest are working very heavily on. Thank you for giving us this comprehensive vision, Malena, in response to this challenge. Thank you to the Minister of Chile for telling us how to take the policy and implement it in the form of action. So we will try to continue to take some of these projects at the pilot level and expand them to the larger scale. I want to thank all of the people who joined us to do, our panelists and the people working behind the curtain to make this possible. Thank you very much.